Do carnivore and low-carb diets reduce your lifespan? I'm Dr. Eric Westman. On my channel, we review and critique other videos trying to dispel and debunk all of the misinformation there on YouTube. If you don't have my top 10 tips on how to start keto right, please look in the description below. This video was sent to me. Thanks for giving me your ideas, by the way, and your comments and feedback. I do appreciate it. This is from Dr. Layne Norton. And I looked up Dr. Layne Norton. I've known the name, haven't watched much of his YouTube before, but I think it's pretty good. And he's actually talking about Valter Longo's take on science, and let's see what he has to say.
All right, guys, it's Friday, and so you know what time it is. It's time for What the Fitness. So this week, we have a video that was sent to me by a very popular fellow influencer and scientist, and I'm not gonna say who it was because I respect their privacy, but the text message just reads, "This guy." And it is Valter Longo, and he was on Rich Roll's podcast, which, no hate to Rich, I'm actually going to be on his podcast and would love to address some of these claims on his podcast. Longo is a researcher who has published, I would say, some like anti-protein research is the best way to describe it. And this is him talking about healthy diet. Before
we get to that, Dr. Layne Norton is a PhD and has trained with one of my teachers, that Don Layman, who has done a lot of great work on protein. And so I would say that the background and credential of Dr. Norton in terms of protein is probably highly one of the best, really. Now, Dr. Valter Longo, so I've never met Dr. Norton. I've met Dr. Valter Longo before, and at a meeting, we were both on the same panel, and it turns out Dr. Longo was one of the people who opened the Biosphere 2, I think it was called, when people had to come out because something was wrong with their health. They were trying to stay in a enclosed area and do vegetarian diets. And so it's important to know the background of people, because if you start from a certain, let's say you were a macrobiotic follower in the 1960s and 70s, you're going to think maybe that you're biased in that direction. So I haven't met Dr. Norton, but I have met Dr. Valter Longo.
A low-carbohydrate diet is bad for you in general unless it's a plant-based low-carbohydrate diet. Low-carbohydrate diet and high protein are not good for you. It should be the other way around, low protein, high carbohydrate. It's better for lifespan to be an 80% carbohydrate diet than to be in a low-carbohydrate diet. In the longevity diet, we talk about fats, yes, but certain type of fats, the high olive oil, high nut diet is better. Prominent experts will say go to a no-fat diet, no matter what it is. Sure, it seems to be true, better to not have saturated fats, animal fats. And again, the epidemiology agrees with that. But when we're talking about these monounsaturated fats, olive oil, nuts, probably certain fish like salmon, that seems to be consistently associated with living longer. If a low-carbohydrate diet is not so good for you, let's look around.
So this is a situation where it's like two truths and a lie. So he said a low-carbohydrate diet and a high-protein diet is bad for you in general. So about 2014, Longo published a paper in Cell that got a lot of traction. And I think that the headline takeaway was, high-protein diet as bad for you as smoking when it comes to cancer. So if you actually read the paper, protein did not affect all-cause mortality or all cancer incidents. Shouldn't that be the takeaway? Instead, they did subgroup analysis with no actual reasoning, eliminated vast swaths of data, ignored data to the counter, and basically their takeaways was, well, protein's bad for cancer. Again, their overall cohort didn't show that. Their conclusion wasn't supported by their data, in my opinion, anyway.
I like that. I like his style. And we see that all too often, where the data in a study are not really followed when you see the conclusion or the title or even the news release about it. Many different biases in there. Always consider the context, because if you're going to say a high carb diet makes you live longer, that's not true if you have diabetes. if you have diabetes, you don't live longer on a high carb diet. You die from the diabetes. So, and I have to say that remember the PhD working with animals and seeing things there, it's a different context, different place entirely than a clinical setting where you're seeing people affected by all of these chronic medical conditions that actually I can reverse by getting people to eat more fat and more protein. And so taking studies from mice living longer or fasting them and applying it to humans is just a huge leap. So let's say you were just otherwise healthy and normal, you didn't have any of these clinical metabolic issues. Does that really help you? I don't know. I think the problem in this space, as Dr. Norton is saying, is that there is a lack of comparison groups, so that it would be great to see a low carb or a keto sort of comparison to what Dr. Longo is talking about. Typically, these aren't the comparison sorts of studies. It's usually the plant-based versus, the standard American diet, for example. So let's keep going with Dr. Norton's point of view.
And it wasn't supported by other experts like Stu Phillips and my PhD advisor, Don Lehman, who actually wrote a letter to the editor about this journal article, which Cell refused to publish and instead said that they could post it on their message board. That's not supposed to be how science works. So I actually published it on my website, biolane.com. I'll put a link to it here in the description, as well as a link to the original paper so you guys can see, where they pretty much ripped this paper apart. Not that it was a bad study in general, but that the interpretations of the data were inappropriate, the conclusions drawn were inappropriate, and I don't know why Longo beats this drum of why protein is bad for longevity. And a lot of this gets tied around the idea, well, we have these associations. Well, first off, the association with protein and mortality is not consistent at all. Neither is it consistent, the association with cancer. And he's also tying in, well, protein activates mTOR, and mTOR is a target for cancer therapy, and therefore it's bad for longevity. Again, this is an example of scientists confusing an acute short-term response with long-term outcomes. I can take any macronutrient and make it sound like it's bad for longevity because dietary fat reduces flow-mediated dilation, and FMD is a predictor of heart disease. High carbohydrate diet, which he's promoting. Carbohydrates spike insulin, and high insulin is bad for longevity. You can take any macronutrient and find a short-term mechanism that can support whatever claim you want to make. What are we supposed to eat? Nothing? Maybe to Longo because he's a big proponent of fasting, I guess.
That's right. I love that, the twisting of the science to meet the political, socio-ethical, economic agendas rather than the scientific agenda. And the idea of fasting, I saw that once by a speaker who said this food causes inflammation, this food causes inflammation, therefore I don't eat. And come on, that taking it to the ridiculous end of, well, if you don't eat, you die, so you have to eat something. And I really like Dr. Norton's style.
So maybe he just wants us to eat nothing. I don't disagree with what he said about certain types of fats. We do know that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol, which is an independent risk factor for heart disease, and quite frankly, is probably why any research associating protein with negative health outcomes actually shows up.
Oh, well, I don't agree with that, Dr. Norton. This is the old paradigm view that saturated fat in the food raises the LDL in the blood, and the LDL causes the heart disease. There's been a big shift toward metabolic syndrome being the bad actor, and that's kind of smacks of the old paradigm view there that I don't worry about saturated fat personally. And the researchers in diet, actually, I don't think, no, Dr. Lehman was not part of the group because the saturated fat researchers, as Dr. Arnie Astrup in Europe, Dr. Jeff Volek at Ohio State, all got together on an article some years ago now that basically said saturated fat is not a problem for cardiometabolic risk. So I don't like that part, Dr. Norton.
Because higher protein diets tend to be higher in saturated fat. A high protein diet, low in saturated fat, in my opinion, and based on the evidence I've seen, is not going to be associated with heart disease or cancer or many of these other things. That being said, I do agree monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats that you find in like olive oil and nuts and whatnot are probably better for you than saturated fat. I think the evidence is pretty clear on that. And then things like fish, that's also quite good for you. And the idea of eating a lot of plants, I think that's good for you as well. We have a lot of data showing that high fiber diets are good for mortality and longevity. And again, a big reason why any research shows up showing that protein is bad for mortality or cancer or whatever is because high protein diets tend to be low in fiber. Same thing for low carbohydrate diets. But if you're eating enough vegetables on a low carb diet and getting enough fiber, you're going to get these benefits. The reason this high carbohydrate diet or 80% carbohydrate minimal fat diet may be good for you is simply because it's going to be very high in fiber in most cases. So I agree, fish, nuts, olive oil, probably good choices. I also agree that fiber is a great choice, but I strongly disagree that protein or low carbohydrate diets are inherently bad. I think that this is an issue of confounding variables, and while I don't think Longo is like a scam artist or anything like that, I do think he's caught up a little bit in his own bias, and he's not looking at the picture clearly and seeing these confounding variables, in my opinion. That's it for...
Yeah, so that was a good summary, although now that I think about it, Don Layman, one of Dr. Norton's teachers or the PhD advisor, years ago, this was 10, 15 years ago, kind of looked on the high-fat diets with some, I don't know, trepidation. I don't know, maybe he's changed over the years, but we shared some meetings together, and the higher protein diet advocates, people studying higher protein diets, Dr. Layman, one of those, and the higher fat diet researchers really didn't come together, and the clinical doctors, Dr. Atkins, Dr. Eads, Dr. Rosedale, Dr. Bernstein, all used higher fat diets and higher protein diets, combining the two. So it actually kind of makes sense seeing the background of Dr. Norton that he might still be afraid or think that saturated fat is a problem. I don't agree that the fiber is such a big issue or some of those other nuances, but in general, I think this is a good critique of a biased view that Dr. Longo has. And at the end of the day, there are a lot of ways to be healthy. I don't think we know exactly how to match the best diet to people yet. And certainly if you're suffering with diabetes or other metabolic problems, that thing that Dr. Longo said that you'll live longer on a higher carb diet doesn't apply at all. You want to fix those metabolic problems, then you'll live longer. He's just thinking about studying a different situation entirely. Well, I hope you like this. If you do like it, press like and subscribe so you don't miss out on further content. Get my top 10 tips on how to start keto the right way. And again, I'm working on something big, and I'll let you in on that very shortly. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.